You got a chair and everything.
Well, afternoon and welcome to the Miller House Sunday presentation. My name is Joseph Pierce, and just as an aside, any Italians in the audience, because today is St. Joseph's Day.
No.
So, you want to get me something, go ahead. But mostly, I have the honor to introduce our guest this afternoon. And I tell you about introducing. It's never an easy thing to do. It's especially not easy when so many people in a historical society in a town where you have become a recent resident have come to live. Because you're introducing people to other people who know him way better than I have been able to do so far. So here's a bit of well-meant advice. Never bet on an election, or you might end up introducing for the rest of the year. But our speaker today is Mr. Martin Meyer, AIA, Bachelor of Architecture from Kansas State. As you can see, his précis is so long you have to read it. Licensed architect in the state of Iowa, in case you're thinking about something. Board member for the Missouri Board of the American Institute of Architects, representing the St. Louis chapter. And Hannibal Historic Development Commission chamber member, which, that's last, I think, position of honor. So without any more messing around, may I introduce Mr. Martin Meyer.
I've had the pleasure recently of getting to know Keokuk and Lee County here a lot better. I switched firms about 18 months ago, and I'm now with Poepping Bach. And because of their presence in Keokuk, I'm getting to know a little bit more about this community and its joy. So it's really kind of fun for me to be here because I'm curious and I like what I see here. So 6 months ago, you asked me about, hey, come talk to us, and she said, what do you know about 1880s architecture? And I said, I know how to maintain 1880s architecture buildings. So that's the little twist. That's the twist that we're going to talk about today. Is about. I assume some of you might be in older homes. So a lot of what I'll talk today about is not necessarily history, but is what to do with your bit of history. So the term drafty old houses. Everybody knows about the term drafty old houses. Well, I would argue that that's not so bad in some situations. So if you live in an 1880s house, that house was not necessarily designed to be energy inefficient. They cared about spending money on energy back then too. But the expectations were different. Thermal comfort, the idea of thermal comfort was different. So energy conservation back then might have been putting on another wool sweater. You also have a situation where your house built in 1880 has changed and moved and grown and expanded and contracted. So some of those elements of that building might have loosened a little bit. So there might be some things that are a bit different. So we'll talk a little bit today about how your house should breathe. So air movement and ventilation is often a pretty fundamental way to deal with maintenance of your building over the long term. So our building industry, architecture and construction is all over the place. If a new product comes out, well, there's going to be a study to support that product and the sale of that product. If another new product comes out, well, they're going to have a study in industry that supports and debunks that theory and touts their new theory. It's constantly changing and flowing, and somebody always has a better idea, and it also is about chasing that dollar. What's going to be the greatest new thing to sell? The one thing that is critical to understand about buildings and energy conservation, that of all the energy that is expended in the United States, a third to a half of that is spent on buildings and energy use in buildings. So if we are to be a more conservative society and we want to try to save energy, save energy on gas and on your cars, but why not attack the energy spent on buildings? And there are a lot of things that can be done to do that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we should shutter historic homes by any means. It means that there are things that we can do and concepts that we can employ to better use our historic buildings. So that drafty old house, a lot of the function and features in that house were on purpose and can be repurposed moving forward. Part of that energy that kind of goes back and forth and wanes and waxes is there is a school of thought that says that we should make our houses super energy efficient and super airtight. Well, you know, some of that means that we have to go into our houses and we have to caulk every crack, and every seam and function has to be sealed. And what that does is that makes that house super airtight. Doug Rye is a radio personality, and he hosts a show called Home Remedies, and he is a big proponent of super tight, super insulated houses. Other industry people do want to tout the same thing, to make something super insulated. Insulated concrete form industry is something that they want to make something super airtight. Again, those industries that support insulation are, you know, Owens Corning and other insulation makers, and they always have newer, better products. But too much of an airtight building is not necessarily good. No air movement is not good at all. So we have to think about the indoor air quality that we leave behind. So many things in our industry change to try to make things better, and we learn things every day, and they change. So we've always, not always necessarily, but there's always been a conscious effort to understand that indoor air quality is important. In the 1800s, there was a recommendation of air changes within a house, and this gets into my nerdy engineering architectural point when I start talking about numbers and equations. But in the 1800s, 30 cubic feet per minute of air change was the recommendation. And it changed in 1970 to 20 CFM, and in 81 to 5 CFM. And now back to 91, it's 7.5 CFM per minute as those recommended air changes. Our industry is always really good about establishing a criteria for us to meet, and things change as we grow and learn. So those current codes, the residential code, the international building code, requires those kinds of air changes. Think about the term of 3 air changes per hour. So that a volume of voluminous building like this is that all of this air has to leave the building and new air has to come back into the building 3 times in an hour. And that's really amazing to think about. But that's good and that's healthy. And in old buildings, that's often extremely possible. So we can make a building super airtight, and we can make it super energy conservative, so you're not going to spend a lot of money on energy. But that airtightness comes with consequences. If we were to make that house so very tight and then still meet those energy codes, you have to introduce mechanical ventilation to be able to provide that necessary air change to meet those codes. Wait a minute, I thought we were trying to conserve energy, and now we're adding the power that it takes to move that mechanical ventilation. So there's a disconnect there. If you have an older house, it might be leaky, but you don't necessarily have to employ that mechanical ventilation. So that indoor air quality that I mentioned, if that building is super airtight, there are more problems from within the building than necessarily outside of the building. You know, if you think about the quality of the air from inside the building, you've got water vapor, you've got radon, you've got mold, you've got carbon monoxide, you've got off-gassing from materials, we call those VOCs. You also have the formaldehyde that vents from the materials. So those are all generated from within the building. Well, let's get that stuff out of the building. We don't want that stuff in the building. So ventilation is key. Now, I'm not saying don't be energy conservation conscious. We want you to be able to save money, and we want you to be able to take care of your house. So 2 quick ways to attack that. You can keep your mechanical equipment, your heating, air conditioning, and equipment up to date. So if you have equipment that's more than 15 years old, things change in our industry and the equipment becomes more efficient. So it's probably out of date. So you can probably increase your efficiency just by changing the mechanical equipment. But you can also, on the other hand, is make your building and your house more energy conscious by attacking that envelope, by increasing the insulation value, by sealing all those edges. You know, the attic, that envelope for insulation needs to be on the floor of the attic. We can increase that and allow ventilation to flow freely on top of that envelope. There's going to be air infiltration at the eaves, at the baseboards, at the crawl space underneath this. Think, when you leave, walk out front and look back at the front porch, and there are two wonderful medallions either side of that stairwell. Those are awesome examples of an air grill simply meant to ventilate the space underneath that front porch. So that's a good passive ventilation example. You know, the sill plates at the floor to the wall connection, light fixtures like this is a form of an area where we might have some infiltration. Of course, around the windows, at the sash, around the perimeter, those are all places that we might be able to seal things up. So there's always a case for ventilating an old house. But the thing that you have to think about is another nerdy engineering issue is we have to provide positive pressure within the house. So the heating and air conditioning equipment that we use has to provide positive pressure inside so all that old air gets pushed out. Think of blowing up a balloon. You know, when we blow up a balloon, we're providing positive pressure on the inside of that balloon. And when you do that with your mechanical equipment, providing that positive pressure, you're blowing out all that old, stale air and then bringing in new, fresh air to that space. So you don't always just want to concentrate on the interior space. You want to concentrate on the attic because there is going to be chances to contaminate the indoor air from the insulation fibers. In the attic, if you don't take care of the eaves and so on, you might get some animals there, birds and rodents. So you got to think about the fact that there's some poop that you have to think about. So you want to make sure that those things are closed off and ventilated. And you also have a lot of dust. Now, the basement, of course, you have to think about not only the mold, but there's probably lead vapors. There's a lot of moisture and dust. And I mentioned the radon. Radon is naturally occurring. It's a part of the decay chain, so it's always going to occur. And if you have some pest control, there's probably going to be some termaticide that you have to think about. We want to make sure that that's all ventilated. Ventilate the crawl space in the basement and outside. Now you also have to think about some outside contaminants too. There might be some pollen, there might be fumes, there might be mold, and there might be dust from around the area. So you constantly want to ventilate those spaces as well. Now, it's the indoor air quality that's key too, but you also have to think about there might be some other material degradation as a result of lack of ventilation. In the attic, if that attic is not ventilated, most modern shingles are only designed to be on a substrate with the temperature of less than 105 degrees. So if your attic gets too hot, you're going to basically boil those shingles. So, and I have seen that, and it really does ruin your shingles. You have to ventilate the attic. And here's the formula in me again. You have to figure out the square footage of your attic and then divide that by 150, and that square inch factor is how much free ventilation you should have on your vents on your gables. You can also get that ventilation at the eaves and also have a ridge vent too to create that ventilation. On the walls, our industry is changing dramatically on how to insulate walls. And again, this gets pretty technical, but if you don't have a proper placement of that air barrier, then in that vapor barrier, you've got air and vapor movement through that wall. You can create a situation where that moist vapor is condensing at the wrong place, and it's going to degrade any bad insulation, degrade the wood. It then creates an environment that's rich for mold spores to form. And you have to think about all those things. So in our climate, in our area, the old formula was always to have the vapor barrier on the warm side of the insulation, but that doesn't necessarily hold true, as we find out, because it's just as hard to insulate in the winter as it is to insulate in the summer because of the extremes of our climate. So we're finding out more information about where to put that vapor barrier. The permeability of the vapor barrier has to come into play, and we always want to make sure that that's done right, and it's often not. And again, it just comes, we have a lot of problems with our walls as a result. You also have degradation to the paint systems and the finish systems on your house. That paint is not intended to be an air and vapor barrier. It's intended to be for material protection. So a clapboard house, if you think about it, air was intended to move up the back side of that clapboard into your wall and to provide a little bit of ventilation and circulation in the cavity of that wall. So if you do paint your house, be careful if somebody uses a spray painter to spray your clapboards, because they're filling in all the voids that way. If they do that, it's just simple as when it dries, make sure they take a knife and they cut the bottom side of that clapboard every time to make sure that that ventilation is maintained in that clapboard. If you don't, that air and vapor is going to find its way through that wall, and if it's stopped by that paint barrier, well, that's when it's going to blister and peel. So that's why you have to maintain your Newer modern systems for insulation are moving away from bad insulation in between studs and moving to a continuous insulation barrier on the face of most studs. If you think about it, if you want to try to have a composite R value on a wall, and if you might have seen this in some cases where you can actually see the studs on broadcast through the wall on a cold day, based on where the vapor is condensing on the side of the wall. There's a thermal transfer at each stud from the inside to outside. Not so at the insulation barrier. So if you have a composite rigid insulation on the face of that wall, you've solved a lot of that problem as well. If you think of a term that the industry uses called rain screen, a lot of times that siding or that veneer is simply meant to be to shed water away from the building and not necessarily as being a barrier. So rain screen principle means that you provide ventilation behind that screen that is just there to shed water. Masonry again, masonry is intended to breathe. And if you do go back and you paint your building, or you do put a masonry sealer on your building, or be careful about graffiti prevention methods and so on, you're actually lessening the value of the masonry and its ability to breathe, and you create a barrier. When air and vapor transfer is not allowed, the masonry might spall, the mortar might be degraded, and you're going to have some problems. So make sure that the masonry is allowed to breathe as well. Some maintenance tips. And the takeaway again is that the HVAC system has to be properly designed to provide positive pressure within the house. And what do the real estate agents say? Location, location, locations. Well, the architect's going to say ventilation, ventilation, ventilation. It solves a lot of ills. If you think you have a mold problem, ventilation is the cure for your mold problem in most cases. So again, take care of your envelope. To shed water is another takeaway. So those are things to help you simply maintain that bit of history that you have. And if we do maintain them and maintain them properly, they're going to be around for generations to come. So hopefully that's a lesson that we can learn today. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope it was a bit of help to preserve your history. So thank you.
Thank you.
questions? Yes, Joe has one, so you're next. Go.
Thank you, miss.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, quick thing. I was concerned if occupancy is a factor at all in ventilation. In other words, if you're like one lonely old guy living in a big old house, or if you have a large family and plenty of animal friends, is that a factor in ventilation?
It is, it's funny, because those formulas that I went into before actually factor number of bedrooms. And then they say, okay, there's gonna be one person in each bedroom except the master bedroom, and there's gonna be two. So it does factor the number of people in that. Now, in an old house, the glory of a lot of old houses is they're actually designed to close off a room and not necessarily heat and cool that particular room, so that you can then concentrate and zone your heating and cooling. And I think most modern systems anymore are not necessarily zoned that way. And I think that I would, and again, sometimes if you do close off part of that room and you don't have that ventilation, there might be some repercussions of that too, as I mentioned. So it's a balancing act, and I think that it just means that you need to take some special care when you're working with your contractors to make sure that those things are designed just right for your particular needs.
Okay, I had an 80s house one time, and when we broke into the wall, it looked like corn cobs, little pieces of corn cob. Are you aware of that as being an insulating factor?
Depending on what time it was, I mean 1880s is what you said.
1882.
Depending on what that particular part of that wall was used. A lot of times when I said, these houses were designed not necessarily to be energy efficient, a lot of times they were designed with passive ventilation systems within the house, meaning that they had just like a fireplace chimney, whether this is working or not, is intended to create a draw to continually move air throughout that system. As soon as air exits, there's a void, and you bring more air through it and out, and another void is created, and you move more air out. There might have been other registers or vents. I saw there's a floor vent over here. Is that just for return air, or did that contribute to some passive ventilation system that pulled air through the house naturally? There might be, if you think of a cupola on a house, oftentimes those cupolas were, or an attic fan concept, right? So they were meant to just passively move air. A lot of times those attic fans were added later simply to provide some mechanical ventilation and to continue to help and enhance that draw through the house. So my point is that I can't think of a corn cob necessarily being used as insulation as much as it might have been something that had filled a void that might have been a passive ventilation tank.
Was it fine material?
Yeah, it was gray.
It was probably.
Well, that's vermiculite.
Vermiculite.
Vermiculite is used as an insulation.
1882?
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't have been put in then.
It would have been
It
put
in
after
later.
Yeah.
No,
by
this
somebody.
was partly the original wall. I mean, they didn't, the whole house had never been insulated before. And it was an exterior wall that I broke into to add a bathroom to the side.
I think you probably either pulled some siding off or even looked on the inside. You might have found some holes that had been patched where they blew in or poured in the vermiculite.
Yeah. That happened after the fact. I agree with that.
Well, and maybe farther up, because it was a clapboard house.
Yeah, because a lot of times they would actually take the clapboard off and drill into the
Well, see, I've
sheathing.
seen houses in Keokuk where they drilled us right through
Oh,
the
yeah,
clapboard. It's
yeah.
like,
Lazy contractors do that.
oh, my, that was bad. Anyway, so if, for your information, besides those outside things have wood ducting that come into the house, it was supposed to cool the whole house,
That's really neat.
not just under the porch.
All right. Joe?
Vermiculite was brought up, and I've ran into it here and there. Is that a cause of concern, as asbestos might be, or is it pretty passive stuff?
Passive. I don't know of any real issues with it.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
In terms of tall windows, depending on the size of your wall, but house with a lot of windows and radiant heat loss versus the airflow, ventilation, heat loss through those. Do you have any recommendations on putting up storm windows and that kind of thing? Does that have an effect on what we're talking about today?
There are a lot of different things that you can do. Oftentimes, storm windows are an idea to cut down on some of that infiltration. They're not a be-all, end-all, but they do help protect historic infrastructure. And a lot of times, if those storm windows are designed right, is they can reinforce and continue to be a part of that passive ventilation system, meaning that whether you have a double hung window or probably a triple sash hung window, oftentimes those things are designed to raise the lower sash and pull the upper sash down, again, to get some of that natural draw of movement of air off of the floor and exiting at the top. Warm air rises, and then once you create that draw, you can do that. A storm window can do the same thing. Other ways to make sure that that window is not a real problem is again, you want to make sure that it is weather tight and properly sealed with, with a caulk system or any kind of weather stripping. You don't necessarily have to, and I wouldn't recommend taking out that unit and putting in a new modern unit. Most times the storm window is the most expedient method to fix that window. But also to restore a deteriorated sash, it's not unusual to replace the glass, and sometimes when you replace the glass, you can pick a glass type that has a higher R value. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to put in a double glazed pane with that vacuum in between, but it does mean that you could pick a different material that has a similar R value. And a laminated piece of glass with two small pieces of glass with the right type of film in between those two glasses oftentimes has the same R value as that double pane glass with that vacuum void in it, and it can fit within the same sash. And that insulated glass doesn't always have to be that 1 inch thick piece of glass. It can actually be 1/2 inch to 3/8 thick for the entire panel and still have the insulated double pane glass. So first priority would be to do the sealing and the weather stripping. Second priority would be to do the storm window. Third priority would be pretty extreme, and it would take a good craftsman to replace the glass with newer, more insulated glass.
I was just gonna tell him, I went through Bob Yap's window
Yeah.
preservation program.
There you go.
And the biggest loss of your energy is infiltration. And he teaches a system of how to weatherize your windows using a kind of a T-shaped metal stripping that you can purchase. And you place that in the channel on the sides, and you put a groove inside your window frame or your sash itself, and that will improve the infiltration. It'll block the wind. And then if you have wavy glass in your windows, I wouldn't replace it. I would save that.
That's the original stuff.
If you've got replacement glass in it, then it's not a big deal. Laminated glass, like in an automotive windshield, does help. He also pushes wood storm windows. Don't buy the aluminum ones, because it changes the character of your house, and it's not as efficient as an old wood storm window. And he has done studies where by weatherizing it in the method he uses and using a storm window, your energy efficiency is equal to or greater than a new replacement window, and it will last forever. Because the old ones were meant to be maintained, not replaced. The modern windows, especially you mentioned gas-filled windows, the lifespan on those is they usually start deteriorating in about 5 years, and then they become worthless, and you can't fix them, you have to replace them. So you're better off keeping your old windows and restoring those and avoiding the vinyl.
Planned obsolescence.
Yes.
I mean, what good is it if you don't have to buy a new one in 5 years, right?
Most of your energy use in the house does not go through your windows. Only about 10% possible. It's in the attic. So, and the major loss, like I said, is infiltration. So if you can seal them, put a storm window on them, you've solved most of the problem. The salesman for the new windows, they say, you know, you're gonna save energy, but if you ask them for a payback period, the payback period is longer than the life of the window.
Right.
So you never pay them off.
Mhm.
So you're better, instead of paying $400 for a window, you're better to pay a guy to restore them for $200 or $300, and you're ahead.
May I observe that once again, history gives us the correct answer.
That's a good point. So I agree with that 100%.
Thank you.
Well, again, thanks again for the opportunity, and if anybody has any other questions, I'll hang around for a little bit in the wings, and we'll have a conversation. But
Well, and you're welcome, we have drinks and food out in the, also we have a listing there where they're signed in the book of our Sunday specials for the rest of the year through October. So, then you'll know what's coming up. Thank you, Mark.
Bob Yap was in Hannibal, right? Isn't
Yes.
that
Yes.
what he is now? So,
Yes.
yeah.
He teaches classes all the time
Yeah.
in his Belvedere School of Historic Preservation.
Yeah, and I wish SCC would have a course to start teaching people how to maintain like plasterwork, woodwork, windows, and but just things like that, and you know, reconditioning. I mean, they have such a